Don is good.
Okay, thanks. Well, I appreciate the time for this interview. Got a whole bunch of questions, and I reached out to a couple of people in the club, and everyone's excited to hear this and to hear from you again. So,
all right, well, fire away.
First question is, before you met Mr. Peary, what kind of angler were you?
Well, my dad was an avid outdoorsman, hunting and fishing, and growing up in Pennsylvania, I mean, that's what we did. And I loved hunting, I loved fishing, but he was really almost 100% into trout fishing. And, you know, he tied his own flies, and he was a fly fisherman, and of course, that's how I was brought up, fishing the streams. And back then, in the early years, there were still about 10,000, I believe it was about 10 or 12,000 miles of free-flowing streams in western Pennsylvania. So it was really some serious trout country. So I became pretty proficient at an early age, 12, 13, 14, you know, presenting flies and following in my dad's footsteps. And I loved catching fish, and we caught an awful lot of fish. Occasionally we would have a trip out west and fish some of the, you know, great streams, the Snake River in Idaho, and fished all through Yellowstone and up into Montana. So, you know, we were avid trout fishermen. And I loved to fish. However, as I got older, and there were more and more reservoirs being dammed up, you know, and the summer months and the warm water species all of a sudden became, I should say, even in western Pennsylvania, became more popular because there were more reservoirs to fish. And so my dad had a boat, a little 14-foot aluminum boat, 10-horse engine, and that kind of thing. And we did go to some of these new lakes, new reservoirs, and fished for bass, and pretty much had zero success. but being an avid fly fisherman, I was of the opinion, and I think my dad was too, that, you know, it was important to be able to physically present lures and you know, in a very, very, you know, professional kind of way. So I became proficient casting with bait casters. I just practiced at it, thinking that would somehow make a difference in my success. And just because I was pretty much, well, actually, I was an athlete, and I had good hand-eye coordination. So after a while, you know, I could literally throw that lure, you know, in a coffee cup, you know, at 75 feet. So I got really good at casting, and my success did not change one iota. You know, it didn't make any difference, obviously. And so this went on for quite a few years, and I just persisted. And as I got older, I had, you know, the best boat, I had the best equipment, and I could still, you know, cast that lure, boy. I could cast it behind my back and hit that coffee cup, and never had any success whatsoever.
Now, at that point, were you mostly fishing, did you switch from fishing streams and rivers to reservoirs and lakes at that point?
No, but the general opinions back in those days was that, you know, you fished your trout in the spring, and when the hot days of summer came around, you know, trout fishing was over. So the going to the reservoirs, the newly formed reservoirs in our part of the state, in the summer months was the, you know, that's what you did in the summer. The only problem was I was still catching a lot of trout in the spring, but when it came to the fishing the lakes and the reservoirs, or even we fished the Allegheny River quite a bit too, and it had muskie and had smallmouth, we'd end up fishing with some live bait and maybe catch a few small fish, but I mean, really had no success whatsoever. So in 1969, when I had the first opportunity to run into Buck Perry, he had just really started getting some recognition, and Fishing Facts was coming of age, and I came across one of the little books, that comes in the pie pack. And I just found it on the ground at a boat ramp at one of these western Pennsylvania reservoirs. I remember it like it was yesterday, Shenango Reservoir. Picked it up and read it, and it was, of course, fascinating to me. And being avid, even though not so successful, but being an avid fisherman, I was really intrigued by this stuff that I read. Well, long story short, I ended up meeting this guy, meeting Buck in Florida, 1969, and he was at a lake called Orange Lake in McIntosh, Florida. And when I met him, there were about 7 or 8 guys that were on this fishing trip with him, fishing Orange Lake. And I found out later that they were all writers from national magazines like Outdoor Life, Sports Afield, and they had tagged along with Buck to have this little fishing trip. And I was amazed that when they were sitting in the diner at night having a little something to eat, when he opened his mouth, these guys it was like the old E.F. Hutton thing. I mean, everybody just stopped and hung on every word he had to say. So I was pretty impressed with him when I first met him. But at the same time, I had been fishing the same lake that they were fishing for 3 days on just a little vacation. And I hadn't caught the first 12-inch fish. And these fellows that were these writers that were with Buck sitting at the table, and they were laughing and joking about, how many 10-pounders they had caught. And when I found out they were fishing that same lake, I was, kind of intrigued. And fortunately for me, after I broke into the conversation and asked them to share a little with me, Buck felt sorry for me and found out I'd been fishing the lake for 3 or 4 days, hadn't caught a fish, and he said, "You come down here the next morning, go out and fish with him." And he'd show me how to catch fish in this lake. Well, Orange Lake is about 20,000 acre Florida-type lake, just a big bowl. And it's rimmed with lily pads all the way around the lake, of course, which is where I was spending all my time, till I was introduced to Buck. So he takes me out, and we're driving across the lake the next morning at daybreak. And we're in the middle of the lake, and he shuts the engine off. I thought we were crossing from one side of the lily pads to the other side, some magical little place, And we stopped dead center in the middle of this lake, and I'm looking, you can barely see the shorelines in any direction. And he just shut the motor off, and he looked up at me, and never forget this, and it all had such an impact on me because, as I found out later, of course, the importance of everything he said, and then just in the 5-minute period. But he stopped the engine, it was dead silent out there, and I'm looking for, is there some stumps out here? Somebody buried some Christmas trees, same old stupid thinking. And he said to me, first thing, he says, "You've got to understand, or nothing else I ever say is going to make any sense to you, but you got to understand this first, and don't ever forget it. Deep water is the home of the fish." Now, when he started into this little 5-minute, education of mine, I had no idea until later on just how important and how dead on, that it all was. And he said, even in Florida, people think, well, I make that statement, deep water's a home of the fish. 90 to 95% of all big fish, they school together, and they live in and spend 90 to 95% of their entire adult life somewhere in deep water. And given the depth of water to be available, if there's 30, 35 feet for a largemouth bass, that's where he's going to spend most of his adult life, period. End of story. He said, but in Florida, the guys always say, well, there's no deep water here. Well, that's not true. There is some. But when you are limited in depth, he said, there is a cutoff. And that cutoff, don't ever forget this, will be 8 to 10 feet. He said, if there's water deeper than 8 to 10 feet, the school of fish will always take that deep water home area. And I put it this way. It's either the deepest water in the lake or the deepest water in an area of the lake, or in the case of some Florida lakes, the deepest water available. But the fish will be living in deep water. And he said, I shut the motor off here for a reason. We're sitting in an area of this lake that's 14 feet deep. And he said it's a slot of water with shallower water all the way around it. And this slot runs for about a mile. And it's only about 75 yards wide, but it's 14 foot deep and surrounded by 8 foot flats. He said, all the fish in the lake are right here. And I'm looking around. I can't see anything but water. I can't see, there's no target to throw to, which is, of course, what I had been brought up on. And the rest, they say, it was history, because he had my attention, but I still couldn't make any real sense out of it. He said, now, fortunately, once or twice on a normal fishing day, fish become active and they will move out of this deep water area. And again, fortunately for us, these movements or these active periods during a day normally happens once or twice on a normal fishing day. He said, but these movements aren't in a haphazard fashion, but on well-definable routes. And these routes are bottom features of the lake that are different in some respects from the surrounding bottom area. So here I had my entire education on, on basically Buck's, all of his findings were, condensed down into about a 5-minute little talk. And he said, now in Florida, and of course he told me he defined these features as structure. He said, now in Florida, there isn't the typical types of structure that we have in other parts of the country. And he was talking, of course, about bars and humps and saddles and all of the different man-made structures and so on and so forth. But he said in Florida, you have basically lakes that are sort of like a bathtub. And he said in many cases, all there is a break line, or this line on structure that runs for a distance where there's an increase in depth. And he explained to me what a break line was. And, of course, I'd been swimming many times in Lake Erie and some areas. I knew exactly what he was talking about when he referred to it. And he said, now, in these Florida lakes, sometimes these break lines will be all the fish have to relate to. And in this case, as in many cases in Florida, those break lines could be as little as 1 foot in depth. Something breaking from 10 feet to 11 feet, and then sloping as it does here into 14 foot of water. Our target is this break line, and it runs for about a mile. He said, now, in a big open lake like this, it's hard to properly fish that break line without being a little bit off. And he said, in many cases, you have to be really precise. So he said, I like to put what I call markers out here. And I'm not kidding you, man. This was in 1969. His markers were gallon milk jugs tied with string, and just regular string, and on the end of that string were railroad ties. Those were his markers. And he turned this little meter on and was going back and forth across the slot up over the break line, of course, and he would remove that marker about 10 feet away from where he actually wanted to fish. And he threw these big milk jugs out there, and we stretched about 8 of them down across this mile of area that we were going to fish. And I was just sort of sitting there keeping my mouth shut thinking, what in the world I couldn't relate it to anything I'd ever done in fishing. And then he popped out one of his little trolling rods on me and said, "Put that stuff that you got in the bottom of the boat, and I don't ever want to see it again." I said, "Okay." So he gave me this little 4.5-foot rod, and with this direct drive reel, and told me how he wanted me to count the layers of this line to get an exact depth of this silly-looking lure. And of course, it was a 250 spoon plug. And we started, and he explained before we actually started to fish. He said, in many cases, not just in Florida, but it's really imperative in Florida, but everywhere, there are two mechanical ways to present a lure. One is by casting, the other is by trolling. And trolling is by far the most important thing that you have to master. Casting is pretty easy. Of course, I knew that because I had become a great caster. I just never caught any fish. And then he brought up the point that about 90% of all water, everywhere, has no fish in it 100% of the time. In other words, if you're not fishing where the fish are, of course, he was saying it in his colorful accent, if you're not fishing where the fish are, I can promise you ain't going to ever catch fish. You can't catch them where they ain't. And he said, what we're doing when we're trolling is we are trying to locate the fish. Once we locate fish, it's okay to, sit back, anchor down, and it's a whole nother discussion, but catch fish casting. But trolling is what we're going to be doing this morning. And we're using this lure, and if we dump out 14 layers of line, we're going to be right at this break line, and you'll see what happens. Once you get to 12 foot, and he told me how to count layers, and once you count those layers out, put your thumb down on that reel and hold on. Okay. Now the answer or the result of what happened was by noontime now, we had caught 55 of the biggest bass I'd ever seen in my life. Wow. And we never left those markers. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And there was no good casting position to the fish, and they were sort of scattered along this break line. There were little turnouts, little changes in the break lines, where all these, what I would just call little fingers, little mini bars on the break line, where there would be a concentration of fish. But trolling was the way to catch them. And even trolling with as much time as it takes and so forth, and many times we had 2 fish on. And we had 3 fish over 10 pounds.
Wow.
And the average fish was 5.5 pounds. It was a huge school of huge bass, and I knew at that moment, without saying anything, that there must be fish throughout the country that never see a lure. This guy just proved it to me. I promise you, those fish hadn't seen a lure ever in their life. Not that they'd know what a lure was when they saw one, but the point is, no one was touching those fish. That lake was so loaded with fish that it was unbelievable to me. And not only that, there was the last schooling size, school fish. There was hundreds of them. You just on and on and on and on. So all the discussion the night before about all the fish these guys were catching over a 3-4 days period obviously wasn't a story. It was all true. So it was at that moment that I determined this guy knows a whole bunch of stuff that I need to know. And if I could learn it, I could probably change the entire, psyche of all the fishermen in this country. Well, of course, Fishing Facts had already started to do that. I was just a little bit late catching up and so forth. But at that point, it was, I guess he could see my excitement and my real interest in learning, because I realized that everything he had told me and what allowed that guy to reach those fish in such what I considered such a simple, after he explained it, a simple operation that took no more than, basically a half hour, and he was on, hundreds of huge, big fish and catching them. So I realized that it was not an accident. That wasn't something that you just happen across. So I think he had this, fortunately for me, he had this idea that I had a real interest in learning. And I think that's one of the problems with all of Buck's material over the years, was most people were like, it's like in any walk of life. Most people want the result. They just don't necessarily want to put in the work. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to do what it really takes. And when they find out that it's not about buying that new lure that's going to be a new magic lure, or that the newest rods and reels, and when they find out that they can't go purchase this success, that it's going to take some study and some work, the average person doesn't want it bad enough. Now, if they can see like I saw, and that was, to me, that was my good luck, is that I actually saw it day one. I saw the result of what his knowledge could do. So it wasn't like somebody was telling me, what it could do. I was experiencing it. So my interest, and like I said, I was a ball player, and I'm extremely competitive, and I wanted to learn everything he knew, and I think he saw that. So from then on, it was just a couple of weeks later, I went home and fished one of these reservoirs. It's the Shenango Reservoir in western Pennsylvania. And I went out and found the bar like he told me, and I ran a few 100s across his bar and started catching 4.5 pound bass that no one in western Pennsylvania was catching. Nobody caught big bass ever in that state until then. And I'm catching like 30 a day, 40 a day, 50 a day.
So after
and
that,
it didn't stop.
So after that trip with Buck, that was your first or your second time out?
That was on my own lake, running a 100, not really knowing what I was doing, but I did with a map find this bar. It was just a simple shoreline bar that reached out to the channel, and I started running a 100. It broke off at 15 feet into 30 feet. And I just kept hitting the end of that bar with a 115 feet, and there the fish were. That was a lucky happenstance as well. So I thought to myself at that point, hey, I can do this too. What? Not just this old guy Buck. I could do it too. And of course, I didn't know enough to even begin talking about it at that point. So I started sending Buck these pictures of these fish I was catching. And then he really got excited. He thought, maybe I've got somebody that can help me, there's somebody that I could teach that could help introduce this, to the rest of the fishing world. So it was about, 5-6 weeks later, I got a phone call, and it was Buck calling from the factory. And he told me he was going to go fishing with a couple of the writers from Fishing Facts down in Tennessee to fish some of the TVA system, and wondered if I'd like to join them. I said yes. And at the time, I was a stockbroker, and I could take time. I could do anything I wanted. So I ran off and went fishing with him a week in Tennessee. And the first day in Tennessee, we go out in the middle of this reservoir, and he runs around with that meter for about 15 minutes out in the center of this thing, out by the channel, of course. And all of a sudden, he threw a marker out, backed the boat up, said, throw the anchor down right there. Anchored down. Then he pointed out past that marker. He said, throw that 100 out there and sink it to the bottom. If there's a fish in this lake, he's going to be right there. I'm not kidding you. Second cast. A big smallmouth. And that's how it went. I mean, it didn't matter wherever we went, no matter what the species. It normally seemed like it was within a half hour, certainly within the first hour. We'd be catching fish, and we'd be catching big fish, and we'd be catching fish that I knew for a fact in areas of a lake that nobody ever fished. In other words, what was striking me at that moment, after just the second trip, is that there are fish dying of old age in lakes everywhere in this country, and the fishermen really don't know about them. They don't know. Most guys are always going to run to Canada. They're going to go, if the grass is greener somewhere else, go somewhere else to catch. Well, everybody knows fish are in Canada. Well, yeah, let's go to Canada and catch them. Well, there were schools of big fish in their backyards, but they weren't aware of it because they never were fishing in the correct way, in the correct place, controlling their presentations and so on and so forth. They knew nothing about, for the most part, the average fisherman knew nothing about mapping and interpreting structure, identifying structure, and getting to that 5 or 8% of the water that does have fish. Those places in most all lakes and reservoirs were never getting fished. And here, one guy's got all the answers. But for some reason, it wasn't taken off where the entire fishing world was transformed. And it still hasn't today. It's unbelievable. And living in Florida, you read some of the stuff about, even fishing in the salt. I mean, when you're fishing in the ocean, you want to talk about a fish factory. Goodness, you almost don't need a rod. I mean, there's so many fish. But people will still write in the magazines and on the news and on the sports shows and talk about, well, that 3/8 ounce, so-and-so jig with the, they're still talking garbage like Buck's information has never really totally reached the fishing world. And it's really a shame.
Right.
We talked the other day. I wanted to try to make a difference. And of course, that over all the years, and basically, for the first 10 years, actually 12 years, I traveled with Buck. In the beginning, when he would give a lecture with the slide presentations, I'd run the slide machine for him. So I heard it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And at the same time, I traveled all around doing and fishing with them in all the Florida type lakes, every type of reservoir out west, Highland 3s, Highland 1s, 2s, lowlands 1, 2, 3, and 4. He insisted that we fished every type of water possible, flatland 1, flatland 2s. And we would always go to different areas of the country to fish all these different types of lakes so that I could get my education. Well, after 12 years, I pretty much had a pretty good education, second to none, actually, because I'm learning from the guy. But it didn't translate to the fishing world, to the millions and millions and millions of people that if they had the opportunity that I had and been able to see it the first time, to really see the result, and then just jumped in with both feet like I did, the entire fishing world would be different today. But unfortunately, Buck was, as brilliant as he was sort of stubborn when it came to getting the word out. When the BASS crowd came in and started running tournaments, he didn't want us fishing tournaments. He didn't want to be part of that, movement with Ray Scott and all those guys.
That brings up a question that maybe you can answer or confirm. I thought I heard years ago, and I don't know if this was just a folk tale or if there's any truth to it, that when, I believe it was Ray Scott, as you mentioned, started these fishing tournaments, the story is that he went over to Buck and he says, I've got this idea for tournaments similar to, golf tournaments. It's going to be for fishing, but I don't want your people or your spoon pluggers to, win all these tournaments. What could we do? And I was told that Buck says, well, if you guy really wants to win, he's going to win anyway, but if you really want to handicap him and discourage him from joining, don't allow trolling. Is that?
That's exactly what happened.
So that is an accurate story?
That's an accurate story, but Buck actually fished a couple of tournaments himself, and, nobody caught anything, and he caught like 100, so when Ray Scott approached him as maybe even a throw-in to doing these tournaments, and when the discussion came out, he said, but, we've got to have different guys winning it. And this, really, Ray Scott was a promoter more than a fisherman. He had a business idea that obviously worked. And, they were selling the big boats and the big motors, and everybody was involved. It was big, big business. And that was the opposite of Buck, and the opposite of his personality. And he made fun of that whole movement constantly, and wouldn't get anywhere near it, wouldn't be part of it, wouldn't, even talk about it. He said, I'm only interested in serious fishermen who really want to learn how to catch fish, But Ray Scott and the Bass crew, they were getting all the press, and we weren't getting any press at all, other than, fishing packs.
And at this time frame, this is in the, early, mid-'70s?
Yes. And, the tournaments were a little bit later than that, but I'm trying to remember the years myself. After my 12 years with Buck, when I decided to move out on my own, and he was really retired from it, he really had no interest in reaching the world with I'm sure that in his mind he would have liked it to be what it really is, the Bible of successful fishing. But he wasn't willing to go out and spend money and jump into that, let's compete, all of their nonsense with our truth. We're going to compete from a business standpoint. That just wasn't something he was going to do. And I knew that I wasn't going to change him. He was a pretty hard-headed guy when it came to that. So when he sort of made it official that he was retiring, he wasn't going to be doing anything. I sort of went out on my own from a business standpoint and tried to simplify everything I had learned to what I considered the most simplified version of Buck's material that could be teachable to everyone, and not make it so difficult that only a select few would decide to do what was necessary as far as the study and so on and so forth. And then I tried to promote it in a way that Buck had never done, and it worked to a degree. And we had the little TV show and had it on WGN, and that worked pretty nice. And pretty soon, I had 100,000 customers. Now, the 100,000 customers, again, all weren't able to see the results that I would see on a regular basis in my learning, and in my interest in learning. They weren't able to. They could see some tapes, or they could listen to some tapes. They could see some footage of catching fish and so on and so forth, but they weren't actually doing it themselves. So Buck wrote something in the little green book that I believe is so true, and I think it's one of the problems that we had in not becoming a real national movement that would have made the difference today. And that was, he said, no matter what you're undertaking, what your hobby might be, it could be golf, it could be fishing, it could be hunting, it could be whatever, it could be tennis. But no matter what you're undertaking and your love is, if you don't have some degree of success, you won't get any satisfaction over time of that sport, of your little, activity, whatever it is. And without satisfaction, sooner or later, you'll just give up. You'll quit. In other words, it's not making me happy anymore. Like a golfer that can't break 100. After a while, he's not playing golf anymore. If you ask him, have you played lately? Oh, I played twice last year. They give it up because they didn't have the success that would garner them the satisfaction that needs to come from your activity. So I think that's one of the problems that there has been with the acceptance of, hey, knowledge is the key to success. Knowledge is the key to fishing success. And there's no two ways around it. That's it. The smarter you become, the more knowledgeable you become about what a fish will do, what he won't do, and all the different lake types and situations that you might come across, the more knowledgeable you become, the more fish you will catch. It's that simple. It has nothing to do with your gear or your ability to cast on a dime, any of that stuff. All that stuff just fine-tunes, that makes you excellent rather than great, or good rather than excellent. But in order to have success and satisfaction, a fisherman needs to catch fish. Period. If you're catching fish, you're having fun. If you're catching fish, your kid's catching fish, your kid's having fun. And that's where the satisfaction comes in. But if you don't have that success early on, after a while, you're going to give it up. So not being able to reach the whole world with the real news and then demonstrate it and have the reaction to it all come in the form of, the average guy on his lake catching more fish than he ever dreamed of, then you'd have a real movement. And it's difficult to do, especially if you don't have the finances to just go out and spend millions of dollars and telling everybody, the true story. So it even for me, after 35 years, it became pretty discouraging, because even if I was with a writer or something, trying to promote something somewhere, I'd say, well, this is even after all the years. He'd say, well, I know you showed that it worked up there in Chicago, or it worked up there in Minneapolis at so-and-so lake, or it worked in Illinois down there at Rand Lake when you took that rider, but, you haven't fished my lake. Now, my lake's a little bit different, So they're still asking me to go out and prove it in his lake, Like somehow a fish that shows you the lack of knowledge, with even guys that are in the business that are writing about it, thinking that a fish is somehow different in his lake than that same critter is in my lake. They're just critters. They're the same. Like what Buck used to say, water's water and a fish is a fish. They don't know they're living in Illinois. They don't know they're living in Minnesota. They don't know they're living in Michigan. They do and act and react to the same things over and over and over and over and over. And if people would just all of a sudden say, okay, look, I've tried everything else. Tried all the new lures. I got the greatest boats and motors. I got all the stuff. But I just don't catch a lot of fish. I heard Donald Trump say something the other day, and I thought, that's what I like to say to the fishermen. Hey, what do you got to lose? Try it my way once.
Yeah.
You don't have nothing to lose, because you've been failing miserably for years, just like I did. I was the epitome of a guy who thought I was really good. Man, I could cast. I looked good. I had all the right stuff. I never caught fish. And then this guy takes me out in this little 14-foot skiff with a 9.5 horse Johnson. I'll never forget that either. It was when they had the brownish bottoms and a white top. And he was chewing tobacco all the time, chewing that Applejack and spit. It turned spit, but it only turned halfway, and that white part of that motor was covered tobacco juice every day. It was gross. I said, man, you got to quit chewing that. He said, yeah, well, while I'm sitting here watching you fire up them Lucky Strikes, you're telling me to quit chewing. So, he was such a character, and he didn't have the fancy boat. He didn't have, and his gear looked like he had built it all himself down in his basement. He just didn't look the part, and all he did was catch so many big fish over and over and over and over.
So, getting back to those early days, you said you met him in '69 in Florida, then a few weeks later, or 5-6 weeks later down in Tennessee. then at what point did you actually work for him full time?
Yeah, for 12 years.
So it was right after that later in '69 where you actually started working.
It was about, I think when I definitely quit being a stockbroker, I believe it was 72. But yeah, I was working full time. We were printing stuff. He had everything was antiquated with Buck. At his shop, he had this printing machine like an old newspaper, like from like maybe from the 40s. You go in and you're cranking this crank handle around, printing stuff out, and he's printing his advanced material by hand. And he was doing it with me. So yeah, I worked for him all right. We worked and worked and worked and worked. It's stuff that, if he would have ever spent the money that he had, could have been done so much better and so much easier, But he was a taskmaster. And I mean, and we would always be doing something. And in many cases, my business sense told me that it was like spinning our wheels. But whatever Buck said, that's what I did,
So you said
I was just thinking,
you worked for 12 years, so that would be from what, 69 or 1970 to 81, 82?
Yeah. And in 1979 or 1980, I was doing the Canadian school, which was my idea to do these schools, the summer schools, and we did one in 79, and then we did one in 80. And that's what he said, that he just didn't have it in his heart anymore to be involved, and I could still use his name and all of that stuff, but he just wasn't going to be doing anything. And of course, up to that point, I still wanted to hold him up on the pedestal and have everybody come to meet him and listen to him and have him on TV. And, he just had run out of gas as far as, I guess he reached a frustration point too, where he loved seeing what we were doing and everything, but he really wasn't involved. So when he said, I'm officially retired, I'm going to keep the factory going, but I'm not going to be running out, away from North Carolina anymore, unless it's to go fishing somewhere and have fun. So, I believe it was 80, 81, I had the idea, one of the schools, it was, I think in 80, at one of the Canadian schools, a senator and a state representative from Illinois came to the school. When I found out who they were, I had this idea of, promoting with states. And let the government pay for it, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so my plan was to make sure these guys... Now, you've been to the Canadian school, right?
No, I have not.
You haven't? Okay.
I wish I did. I don't...
Well, we were in the Winnipeg River, and I took these two guys, and it was on-the-water training and classroom training. But the on-the-water, I would spend some time with every two guys in a boat every day. Sometime. And if I had 40 guys in the class, that was 20 boats I was in during the day. If I had 50 guys, So on Fridays, to give me a little bit of a rest, and at the same time have some fun, we'd have a contest with the students by weight. And I thought to myself on Wednesday, when the state representative from Illinois, his name was Jake Wolf, he was also the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, which when he told me that, my ears lit up, and so I'm already planning something for the future, So I said to myself, or he said to me one night, we were drinking a beer, he said, by the way, that Friday tournament, he said, I'd like to win. And he said, because I'm a competitive guy. He said, so if you were me, where would you do your fishing on Friday? So I told him exactly where he should be fishing in the river, and I said, I want you to put an 800 on with wire line. And I want you to drop into that 60-foot hole underneath that bridge. And I want you to head upstream until you feel that lure come up over that rocky bar. And I want you to, every time you do that, once you know that your lure is past the bar on the upstream side, stop the boat, reel in, go all the way back down to the foot of that thing again. It's about a 100-yard pass. And I said, repeat that pass and do it all day long. Well, I checked on, at noontime, we come in for lunch, an hour break for lunch and then back out. He'd come in with his partner. They had a cooler, and the limit was six fish each. They had 12 walleyes in the boat, and I believe the weight was 96 pounds.
Wow.
You do the math. Average 8 pounds apiece. And I think 2 over 10, I think the smallest fish was 6 pounds. And they took those fish out and went back out in the afternoon. Needless to say, they won. And the following, I think 2 weeks after my school was over, I was invited to stop in Illinois, which I did, visited with them. And they said, could we teach people in Illinois, was their question. What I had taught them up in Canada, could I somehow bring that to the state of Illinois? I said, yeah, I could do that. They said, make a proposal, which I did. I came home and spent a few weeks in the library and looked up all kinds, how many people from Chicago are going to Minnesota every year or going out of state, either Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Canada to fish and leaving Illinois. Well, they were losing about, I think, when I figured everything out, about $70 million in revenue every year by fishermen leaving the state because they didn't think any fish were in Illinois, So my job was to teach them that there were fish in Illinois. So I put this proposal together, and it ended up, I said, I could guarantee you that I could get at least $10 million to stay in Illinois of that $70 million that's leaving, just by educating the fishermen. And I said, I'd be happy to do it for you for the criminally low price of $75,000. And I thought they'd probably agree maybe and cut the number in half and give me a little something, because after all, this guy was in my camp now, and he's the chairman of Appropriations Committee. So he had me throw a dinner for 9 politicians where I paid. And 2 weeks later, they made the big announcement in front of the press that I was the new fishing consultant of the state of Illinois.
Wow.
And all I did was put on like an advanced 3-hour school quote kind of thing in all of the big cities. I think I did 8 of them. And, we would turn out 2,500, 3,000 people, free to the fishermen, state's paying. I got all the big universities and the big hotels to give me the rooms for free because it was a free thing to the fishermen. And I got all kind of free press by taking the raiders from each city, taking them fishing.
And that was in the early 80s?
That was 80, and then in 81, and then in 82, I made a film for them on Lake Michigan. They paid me $35,000 for that. And back then, that was big money for me. And then the following year, I wrote an all-inclusive book, because they didn't have one, of all the different lakes. And I had it, I got art student to help me illustrate the book. And, I did everything, bare bones cheap and pocketed all the money. So I had a 3-year run. And then my good friend, Jake Wolf, they had built this hatchery. It was a state-of-the-art hatchery, warm water, cool water, and cold water hatchery all in one in Illinois. Spent a lot of money.
Oh, and okay. I thought that name sounded familiar. It's the Jake Wolf hatchery,
yeah.
Right?
Yep. And he was giving a speech one day, and he wasn't there on time, so they went up to a hotel room to get him. He had a heart attack and died, 53 years old.
Oh, wow.
Or I'd still probably be the fishing consultant of the state of Illinois. He was my biggest fan. But we made a film. They paid me $35,000 to make this film when the salmon were going in Lake Michigan, and they were going to try to get some corporate people coming in, and the sell was bring your corporate business to Chicago, have your convention here. You have all of the stuff you need as far as restaurants and nightlife and so on and so forth. But you can have your meetings in the morning, and at noontime you can go out the back door and go catch 25-pound, Chinook salmon. So they sent that movie all over the world. They had people coming, and I introduced the guides up there, the big guide association, and it was a big deal. It took me and Jake and some of his crew members he brought, from the State Department. It took us three days. Film was done. $35,000. So catching a few walleyes, at 60 feet up in the Winnipeg River really paid off. But it's funny when a person has that. There was a great example of what we talked about earlier. When a person has that immediate hands-on success by just, implementing some of the simple, basic stuff that we talked about, that triggers them to do all kind of crazy things. In this case, he spent 3 years fishing with me in Illinois. We did all kinds of stuff. I took riders out to, I think I mentioned this, Wren Lake. They said they never catch a fish. It's a big flatland to center of the state. Never catch any fish there, and they had such big plans for it. And they put some bass in there when they flooded the place, and they caught a few early on, but now the fish have disappeared. Well, I looked at the map. I see a causeway going across the center of about midway up the lake. The big lake. It's like 100,000 acres or something. But I see this causeway, and I asked the guide, is there a boat ramp at the causeway? He said, yeah, you can put your boat in right there at the causeway. I said, okay, great. So I take the rider from, not the Chicago guy. This guy was from over at, Jack Earthman's a pretty famous guy. He wrote for a bunch of magazines, Fins and Feathers, Fishing Facts a few times, I think. Good guy. Oh, Peoria. He's the newspaper guy, outdoor guy at Peoria. He said, nobody catch bass in this lake. Okay, great. We put in, he meets me in the morning, put in at the causeway. I didn't even have a map of the lake. I started down the causeway with a 500 and a 400 on the other side of the boat, right? By noontime, he had caught 50 bass. We never left the causeway. Never left the causeway. And when he caught the last fish was like 6 pounds, we got out and took all these pictures, and on Sunday morning in the Peoria paper, full page.
Wow.
Found a new way to fish. Well, hardly a new way to fish. It's 60, 70 years old, but nobody knows about it. But he had all these pictures. Now we go to Bradley University in Peoria to do the show for the state. I think it was on a Thursday night. There were 2,500 people in the room, and the fire marshal shut it down, and they turned away 1,500 people outside. So I came back another night and did a second one for him just because, and it was 2,500 people again, and they turned away another 700 at the door that night. It just shows how people are hungry to really learn, but again, without that hands-on first success and so on and so forth, and the ability to remove all of the nonsense that we're supposed to accept, by what the fishing world promotes, it brings it down to like the few people you have in a club, and the what's left of the Spoonplugging club. Just a few people that were smart enough to recognize the or fortunate enough, like I was, to have firsthand success, to then go and pursue it like it was a college course. And Buck's advanced material was an approved 60-hour accredited course at the University of Michigan, and he wanted me to go up and train all the professors on how to teach the course. And I argued with him about it. I said, Buck, it's never going to work. You can't teach a professor how to teach a course on catching fish if he's never caught a fish. It's just not going to work. It's just going to be a joke. And I really did. I ended up talking him out of it. But it's so much information. It is, in fact, like a college course. If you really want to get into it, 60 hours only is the beginning. Then you have to go out and start to apply all of that. And the average guy just isn't going to do it. The only way we could get him to do it is like I did with Jake Wolf. I take him out and catch him hundreds of big walleyes. Like he literally caught that week, I think, 30 walleyes that he would have mounted prior to learning the information.
Wow.
My wife, I met my wife in the Winnipeg River. She was performing in the big resort up there. She's a singer. And that's where we met. I took her fishing because she wanted to go fishing, and she was beautiful and young, and it was a smart thing for me to do. And at any rate, first day, she was running this wire line. We're fishing 45 feet of water. She's running it better than my students. And she just had the feel. And she caught like 24 walleye that day, including a 10-pounder on her first day. Well, she became, a fishing fanatic. She's caught more smallmouth, walleye, and bass, and northern, and muskie than any of my students. And the last time we were at the Winnipeg River, the biggest ones we ever saw over the years, and we caught probably 3,000 10-pound walleye, me and my students. But the biggest ones we ever saw, we only had 3 that were 12 pounds. That was pretty much cut off. 10, 11 pounds, yeah. 12 pounds, only 3. Well, the last trip up, my wife caught a 13-pounder in September. A 36 inches, and it wasn't full of eggs or anything. It was September. It was huge. And, hold on one second. Okay. You're not going we're not going to your mom's till later, though, right? Okay, fine. Love you, babe. Bye. Say goodbye to my wife. Say not somewhere. But at any rate, again, she had that immediate success. She became an expert spoon plugger. She became so knowledgeable that if a student would ask me a question, I'd have my wife answer it.
Wow. Just
to prove a point. Once you have that initial success, to people like us, people that are competitive by nature, they're not going to quit till they got all the answers, or at least feel like they got most all the answers. We never have all the answers, but